I've met hundreds of travelers since then, but none of them felt like him, and I think that's the part that still gets me walked out of my life. Like he'd only borrowed it for a night, but he's the one who never left. It started like one aft hose slow. Sunburned mornings where the heat rose off the pavement and soft waves and everything around me moved just a little too lazily. I was leaning against the side of the Jeep outside the safari lodge, pretending to be more patient than waiting for the last name on my list when he finally stepped out of the building, dragging an elegant suitcase, felt sipping lukewarm coffee from a dented tin mug. Most of the group had arrived. Already couples in matching cocky loud tourists snapping selfies before the journey even began, but my eyes kept flicking toward the entranced Bahindam and moving like he wasn't quite sure if he belonged here. I stood a little straighter without meaning to. There was something about him, not just his age, which clearly set him apart from everyone else, but the way he carried himself. Upright, composed, like someone who'd spent years being everything for everyone else, and only just now realized didn't have to be. He looked around, scanning the small crowd with uncertain eyes, then spotted me. I raised a hand, smiled. He hesitated before approaching, as if considering whether to turn back, but he didn't. He came all the way, stopping just a few feet from me, close enough that I could smell the subtle cologne rising from his skin. In the heat, you must be the guide, he said. His voice was low and careful, but there was a flicker of something underneath. Something tired, something locked away. And nodded. That's me, let me help with your bag. He clutched the handle like Hugh and ready to give it up, then slowly let go, his hand brushing mine for a second too long. I told myself not to notice, but I did. The others were already packed in, and as I loaded his luggage, he settled into the seat behind me, alone in the last row, which suddenly felt like the most important seat in the vehicle. When I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his gaze was fixed out the window, but his reflection gave him away. High eyes weren't watching the land, they were trying to forget something. We drove insolence for a while, the engine humming over dirt roads, the landscape stretching out like a forgotten dream. Every once in a while, I'd point out a landmark, a fact about the terrain, or drop a joke. That got a few chuckles from the rest of the group, but not from him. Not yet. He didn't seem closed off, just like he was somewhere else somewhere. He couldn't leave, no matter how far we drove. It wasn't until lunch thought he spoke to me again. I was crouched near the fire pit, checking the skewers and handing out plates. He appropriately, almost too quietly, and I nearly didn't notice him until he was right beside me. This place is beautiful, he said. I looked up. He wasn't talking about Thellenscape at Isquard. People come out here all the time with their polished stories, their curated reasons for traveling. He didn't bother with any of that. He looked like someone who hadn't spoken that truth aloud before and wasn't sure how it would sound once it landed. You picked the right place, I told him. Out here nothing hides, not even the things. We tried O'Berry. He didn't reply, but he didn't walk away either. He sat on a nearby rockus, eyes following the drifting smoke from the fire. I went back to the food, but every time I looked over, he wastled, the resolute steady and entirely present in my thoughts. Later that afternoon, when we stopped near the river to stretch and take photos, he lingered behind while the others wandered ahead, and noticed his boots sinking into the soft earth as he moved toward the water. I followed at a distance, not wanting to intrude, but not ready to let him drift too far either. Careful, I said. The ground's unstable near the edge. He turned slightly, the breeze ruffling his silver hair, and looked at me like he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure how. I didn't think I'd feel anything again, he said softly. Not for a place, not for a moment. I stepped closer. But you do now. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked back at the water, then down at his own reflection. I used to come Alave new places, he murmured, but after a while, after enough years of pretending to be okay, even beauty starts to feel like background noise. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. I just stood next to him, not touching, not even close enough for our shadows to merge, but somehow still feeling him, feeling that ache. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He looked up at me then, and I could tell he saw the question in my face before I even asked at my wife. He said, she doesn't know I'm here. There was no shame in his voice, just something heavier, and I knew without him saying another word that this wasn't just a vacation, it was an escape. Final chance to be more than Somian's husband, someone's Father, someone who stayed when everything in him wanted to go. We didn't speak much for the rest of that day, but when he stepped into the Jeep, that evening something between us had shifted, not loudly, not with declarations or stolen glance, just quietly, in a way only we would understand, and that was only the beginning. It was strange how quickly. I started looking for him not just during the quiet parts of the drive or when Wes stopped for lunch, but even, in the small spaces between conversation in. The way the silence felt heavier when he was near. There were 8 other people in that Jeep yet. I only ever noticed Hyman not because he demanded attention. In fact, it was the opposite. He had this way of folding himself into the background. Like he was afraid to take up too much space, but once you really saw him, you couldn't unsee him. He sat with his back, straight hands folded neatly, in his lap always watching. Not like a tourist, not like someone here for adventure, more like someone trying to remember what it felt like to be part of the world again that afternoon. When we stopped near the boab trees, and everyone scattered to stretch their legs, I noticed him sitting alone under the shade, sketching something into a small notebook. I didn't mean to interrupt, but something about the way his brow furrowed told me he was trying too hard not to feel anything, so I walked over mind. If I sit, I asked. He didn't look up. Do you always ask, only when I care? A booth answer that made him glance at me. His eyes were calm, but searching. Hadn't tell me yes, but he didn't move either, so. I sat beside him on the dusty rock close, but not touching. What are you drawing? He closed the notebook before. I could see nothing worth showing. I leaned back, arms braced behind me, letting the heat soak through my shirt. Maybe not to you, but sometimes the things we hide save. Most that made him pause. He turned his head toward me slowly, like he wasn't sure. He wanted to go wherever this conversation was heading, and I wasn't sure either. All I knew was that by near him had started to feel less like a coincidence and more like something inevitable. You talk like someone older than you look, he said finally. I smiled. And you talk like someone younger than you feel. He laughed, not loudly, just enough for it to count. It lingered in space between us, and I realized how badly I wanted to hear it again. The sound was soft, but it scraped. Something loose inside me, maybe because it felt rare, like it hadn't been used in a while. He used to laugh a lot, he said quietly, almost to himself, before everything got so heavy. I didn't ask what everything meant. I didn't need to. He kept his gaze forward, his knees tucked neatly to the side, the breeze catching the edge of his shirt. He looked like someone who hadn't been in love with the world only to find out it didn't always love. You back, I used to think growing old would come with peace, he said, but all it gave me was more time to think about things. I didn't respond right away. He wasn't talking to get advice. He was talking to be heard. You still have time, I said, though I could hear how hollow it sounded in his silence. He looked down at his hands that time, past the moment I said, I do. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. And maybe that said more than if I had. He glanced at me, sharp-lithen. Looked away, his fingers fiddled with the edge of the notebook he was still holding. I wanted to still his fingers with mine, to remind him. He wasn't alone in this ache, but wanting him wasn't the same as reaching for him. Not yet. That's dangerous talk, he said, his voice barely audible. Is it yes, Hesed, because I'm listening, that sat between us like a stone dropped into water? No splash. Just a slow sinking feeling that something had changed, even if we didn't admit it. His fingers stilled his breathing. Slowed, and then without turning his head, he spoke again. I thought I came here to escape my life, he said. But maybe I came here hoping to feel like I had one again. I couldn't tell if he was speaking to me or himself, but the way he said it, like it had surprised him, made my pulse stutter. Hesed before I could say anything else, and walked back toward the others. I stayed behind. For a moment, staring at the place where he'd been, the warmth of his voice still clinging to my skin like dust. I didn't want to shake off. Later, Aziz's sun began to dip below the acacia trees, and I called the group to load up again. I helped him into the Jeep without tasking. My hand brushed his lower back, light and brief, but enough to make him pause halfway up. The step, he looked at me, really looked at me this time, and something passed between us, not agreement, not permission. Just acknowledgement. That night we stopped at a remote lodge, smaller, more intimate kind, where the walls were made of canvas and the sounds of the wild crept in around the edges. The group ate dinner, the fire laughter bouncing through the darkness. But he sat a little away from the others, his plate half full, untouched. I brought him a cup of warm tea, crouching beside his chair, like it was instinct you didn't eat. I said, "Not hungry, you're somewhere else again." He glanced at me. Maybe I'm where I shouldn't be. I could have said the same thing, but I didn't. I just sat beside Hyman, stared at the fire, letting the crackle fill the space. His words left behind when the others drifted off to their tents and the fire burned lower. He didn't move, neither did I. There was a calm in the night, but also something humming. Just beneath it, I could feel it pressing at the edges like the wind right before the storm. He turned his head slowly toward me, his face lit in flickers by the last of the flame, and whispered, "This isn't safe." "No," I said, my voice rougher than I meant it. "Tobe, but safe never felt like this." And then just for a second, our hands touched. Not by accident, not hidden, and neither of us pulled away the next morning. Started quieter than the last. Others chatted over breakfast, linking utensils and laughing too loudly, but I barely heard any of it. I was watching him, not obviously enough to catch the way he stirred his tea without tasting it, or how his eyes stayed on the horizon, even when someone tried to pull him into conversation. Something about him was different. Now, he sat closer to the fire, closer to me, not in an obvious way, but enough to notice enough to feel it. When I helped him into the Jeep that morning, he didn't say anything, but his hand lingered on mine a little longer as he stepped up, and when he settled into his seat, this time not in the back but closer, just behind, Maya's breath moved with mine. The road ahead was long and flat, but the tension in the car felt like it could snap with the slightest bump. We drove for hours. The sun beat down, the land changed color slowly, and the heat blurred everything in the distance, but I could feel him every time he leaned slightly toward the window, every time he shifted in his seat. I felt that the air between us was not longer just air. It was loaded. Around midday, I took the group to a small scenic overlook, mostly for photos and a stretch break, but part of me just needed air. As the others scattered, he stayed behind. Then, almost as if drawn by something neither of us was ready to name, he followed me to the far edge off the hill where the land dipped into a long stretch of green and sky. No one else was near. Just the two of us. Thewin tugged at the edges of his shirt, and the sunlight caught his silver hair like it was touched with fire. "I used to think places like this were just postcards," he said softly. "Pretty from afar, but unreal." And now I asked, barely trusting my voice now, "I don't want to live." I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because the way he looked at me then, it wasn't about the view anymore. It was about everything we hadn't said and couldn't take back. So even if we tried, he'd look down. Pressing his lips together, I keep telling myself I'm just tired. This is some momentary thing. I took a step closer. Not enough to touch, just enough so that my presence rapidarened him like the heat. "Do you believe that?" I asked. He shook his head slowly, not looking at me but I wish I did. I reached out then, just barely, and touched his shoulder. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he looked at me like I was holding a door he wasn't sure he had the strength to walk through. Make it hard to remember why I'm supposed to be careful. He whispered, "I didn't move. I didn't breathe your note alone in that." I said. His lips parted like he was going to speak, but he hesitated. I leaned closer, but not a noto, closed the distance. I was waiting, asking without asking, and for a moment, it felt like he might meet me there. Buff looked away, not in fear, not in shame and restraint, like he was trying to stop himself from remembering what it felt like to be touched with meaning. And then someone from the group called my name. He stepped back first, a clean movement, a break-inth moment, like a snapped twig. We didn't say anything on the way back, but everything about him had shifted. Hewent, avoiding me. He wasn't hiding. If anything, the way he walked next to me after that was more deliberate, like he was daring the wind to carry the truth away. Before it caught fire that evening, the lodge was quieter than before. Mostoff, the others had turned in early after the long trek. I stayed near the fire, pretending to read the map, but really just waiting, listening, hoping he came out of his tent when the stars were already sharp in the sky, wearing a simple jacket wrapped over his shoulders. His steps slower than usual. I stood unsure. Why? Maybe because something in me was already rising to meet him. "I thought he might come," I said. He didn't reply, just looked at me unreadable. I walked to the nearby table and lifted the cloth to glass as a bottle of wine. I hadn't planned it, but maybe I had. He didn't hesitate this time when I handed him the glass. His fingers didn't just brush mine, they stayed, and when I sat beside him close, but not crowded, he turned toward me just slightly, like that space no longer needed to be. "Protected this still isn't safe," he said, his voice lower. Now rougher I know, but I didn't come other to be safe. I looked at him really, he looked, his eyes were softer now, but darker, heavy with everything he wasn't saying. His lips were parted just in auto, make my hands ache. "Then why did you come?" I asked. He swirled the wine slowly, watching the liquid turn in the glass to remember what it felt like to want something without apologizing for it. The fire cracked beside us, throwing shadows across his face, and when he turned to meet my eyes, the look in them was no longer guarded. It was bare fierce tired, of pretending. His foot brushed mine beneath the table. A simple thing, barely a whisper, but I felt it everywhere. We didn't kiss that night, wouldn't even touch again. But when he stood to leave, he paused at my side, leaned in close enough to graze Miss Holder and whispered, "I'm scared of what happens if I stop pretending." And I whispered back, "I'm scared of what happens if you don't." That night the fire crackled lower than usual, casting only the faintest glow across the canvas off shadows around us. Most of the others had gone to bed, their laughter had faded, their footsteps swallowed by the soft earth between tents, until it was just him and me again. But this time we didn't fill the space with talk. We didn't have to. Everything worth saying was already hemming. In the silence between our glances, he sat across from me, one leg crossed over the other, his jacket slipping slightly as the breeze tugged at the edges. I watched his fingers toy with the lip of his wine. Glass slow and absent, like his thoughts were somewhere else entirely, or maybe right here, just trapped behind same fear I felt pulsing in my chest. I stood to stretch, pretending I didn't feel how his eyes followed the movement of my arms, the curve of my back as I rolled my shoulders. When I glanced over, his expression didn't waver, but something in it flickered. "I should walk you back." I said. He didn't answer right away, just held my gaze for a second. Too long. Then he nodded once and stood slowly, like his body had to catch up to the decision. His heart had already walked without speaking. The night was warm and alive, insects singing in the brush, wind stirring the grasses like whispers we weren't meant to hear. His tent was just ahead, the flap-oriented fabric billowing like it had been waiting for his return. When we reached it, he stopped and turned to face me. I expected him to say goodnight, to thank me again for the walk, for the company, for everything, but he didn't sit with me for a while. He asked, and his voice was soft, but steady, the kind of voice you use when you've already decided not to lie to yourself anymore. I followed Jim inside. The lantern cast a low amber glow across the interior. It was simple, just a bed, a chair, a table, with a picture of water, but in that moment, it felt like a different world. He pulled the flap closed behind us, not in a rush, not nervously, just quietly. We sat on the edge of the bed, side by side. His arm brushed mine. I could hear the sound of his breathing, could feel the warmth of his body next to me. He didn't look at me right away, but when he did, it wasn't hesitation. I saw it was a kind of surrender. "I haven't done this in a long time," he whispered. "Not like this." I didn't ask what he meant. He knew this wasn't about lust. It wasn't about breaking vows or forgetting promises. It was about the parts of ourselves we leave untouched for so long that we forget they still ache. I reached up and touched his cheek. He closed his eyes when he opened them again. They were glassy, unsure. "You don't have to be afraid," I said. "I'm not," he replied. "I'm already here." He leaned in slowly, hishing on my thigh, fingers shaking just slightly. Our lips met, not in a crash, not in desperation, but in a trembling pause before the fall. His kiss was soft, uncertain at first, then deeper, more sure. His fingers moved up my chest, not demanding but searching. I placed a hand over his, and for a moment, we just breathed like that, close connected, as if the air had finally given us permission to feel. His jacket slid down once, holder my thumb traced the skin it revealed, and he shivered, not from cold, but from being touched like it mattered again. Like he wasn't just skin and years and memories he guided. my hand beneath fabric slowly and whispered, "Don't stop." The next minutes unfolded like a confession, not frantic, not loud. Just two bodies remembering how to ask and answer without words. His breath caught in my ear as he leaned into me as the rhythm between us shifted. From hesitant to hungry, the tent held its breath with us. My lips found the curve of his neck. His hands slid gently down my spine. The world outside didn't exist. There was only the rise and fall of breathy sound, of clothes whispering away the press of his hand against my chest. As if to say yes here. Time blurred. We moved slowly, like in wrapping. Something fragile. We weren't sure we deserved to hold my hands map head terrain of his skin. "The place is untouched for too long," he responded in soft, shuddering gasps, the kind you release only when you forget the world is still spinning. There were no declarations, no promises, only heat contact need later. When we lay side by side, tangled in the mess we'd made of thigh sheets, he stared at the ceiling like it held all the answers he was too scared to ask. I didn't speak, neither did he, Booty. Reached for his hand, and he let me hold it just for a moment, then he pulled away. Gently, as if the gravity of what we'd done had just landed. "I don't know who I am right now," he said. "You don't thave to know," I replied. "You're allowed to just feel." He nodded, but his eyes were distant again. I stayed a little longer, just long enough to watch his breathings low, just long enough to pretend the night wasn't going to end. When I slipped out of the tent, the stars were still above. It was still shining like they hadn't just watched us undo everything, but I felt different, and Amani knew he did too. The morning after didn't feel like morning. It felt like something else entirely, like waking up in the middle of a thought that wasn't ready to end. The tent was still dim when I opened my ISIS fabric, fluttering softly with the breeze. The sheets beside me were tangled warmths, still clinging faintly to where he had been, but he wasn't there. He sat up slowly, half expecting to hear the sound of water being poured, or his soft voice saying something careful, but there was nothing, just the slow beat of my own heart and the distant chatter of early risers outside. He hadn't left a note and a message, nothing to say what last night had me or didn't mean. By the time I stepped out into the morning light, he was already with the others. His posture was calm, composed. He smiled when Samian handed him a coffee. He laughed at a joke from one of the guests, and when his eyes briefly found mine across the courtyard, there was no shift, no flinch, just Acquio tired kind of recognition. Like we were both already agreeing not to speak off it again. The ride back toward the city was long and full of noise, luggage being zipped, people trading stories about the animals they saw, promises to exchange photos later, but all I heard was his silence. All I felt was his presence just behind me in the Jeep clothes, enough to remember far, enough to feel like a memory already. He didn't speak to me, the whole drive, not in words anyway, but there were moments when his hand brushed the side of his seat near mine, when he adjusted his sunglasses, but didn't look away fast enough, where I knew last night hadn't vanished. It was still between us. It would always be when we reached the lodge where the journey had started. I helped unload the bags as usual. The others thanked me, shook my hand, laughed like the week had been nothing more. Then a highlight reel has stood a little apart from them, his luggage by his side. His hands resting lightly on the strap, I walked toward him slower than I needed to, suddenly unsure what I was supposed to say now that it was over. He saw me coming, but didn't smile. His expression was unreadable, maybe protective, maybe already closing the door. "Thank you," he said. His voice was level, but his fingers were trembling. Nodded. "I hope it was what you came for." He looked at me for a long second, and then in a voice low enough that no one else could hear, he said, "I don't know what I came for, but I know what I found." And that was all. No hug, no promises, just the kind of look that stays in your chest long. After someone walks away that night, I sat in the empty Jeep for too long. After the last light in the lodge went out, I kept thinking about the way he'd leaned into me by the fire, the way he had whispered not to stop, the way his body had trembled. Not from cold, but from letting himself be felt again. But mostly I thought of Butho Isili. We had returned to being strangers, like nothing had happened, like I hadn't memorized the sound of his breath when he let himself come undone a few days past. I took another group out. Outerists came and went, asking the same questions, snapping the same photos. I smiled, like always told the same stories, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see him, and every time I didn't, something Inside, Matitan then one night scrolling through my phone out of habit. I found it a blog post, one of those quiet travel entries that get buried beneath influencer photos and top 10 list, no name, just a title, the place that broke up open, I don't know what made me click on it. Maybe the words, maybe the way they felt, like something familiar, waiting to be recognized. The story was simple. Amanwo had traveled across the world to forget something he couldn't admit to, who had sat by a fire and let himself went, who had met a young man with dark eyes and gentle hands, who reminded him that he still had blood in his veins. He never said my name, never mentioned the country, never even described the night, but I knew it was him, and I knew he had written it for himself, not for me. I read the entry too many times to count. Each time it ended with the same linissima times. The things we bury are the ones that bloom when we least expect them. I never wrote to him, never commented, never tried to find him again, because some stories aren't meant to be chased. They're meant to live quietly in spaces where no one else can touch them. But still, sometimes when I start a new tour and help a guest into the amazing Jeep, I pause for a moment longer then. Should I glance at their hands, their eyes, the way they carry their silence, and I wonder if I ever saw him again. Would he look away, or would he still remember the firelight and the boy, what hushed him like he was something sacred, not forgotten? I never heard from him again, but every time I close my eyes, I can still feel his fingertips pressing against my chest, asking a question he never dared to voice, and I still don't now. The answer maybe I never will, but that doesn't stop me from looking for him, because some Temesti people who leave are the ones you carry forever. I never heard from him again, but sometimes when I glance into the mirror and see someone looking back who's older than I remember, I wonder if IS doing the same somewhere far away, holding on to a night we were never supposed to have, and maybe that's all, Weaver, were a moment too honest to last.